Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast with myself. Now, this is as always, a very exciting one. I'm back after a hiatus of, what feels like forever. But essentially, whilst I was away, I was in France for about 3 weeks, a month, and then basically since being back, I've been swamped by my dissertation, which is actually what we're going to kind of talk about today. And this is what I've got here, is essentially discussing the topic of my dissertation, because it's deeply fascinating and there's some really interesting things. So basically, let's just jump right into it, because today we're going to be talking about manuscript DCC MA1. So just a bit about the manuscript and about my dissertation. So this manuscript comes to us from the Canterbury Archives, and essentially my dissertation has been about translating, editing and transcribing these accounts from 1213 to 1230. That constitutes about 40 folios, and then basically analysing them, because this is during a period of such turmoil, civil strife in England. Essentially, whilst this manuscript was being constructed, you had the interdict, you had the exile of the Canterbury monks, you had the First Barons' War, Magna Carta, you had the Sixth Crusade, all of these different events happening within a 15-year time span, and that's what my manuscript is kind of about. What was Canterbury like during this time? And so this is really deeply interesting, and so I really wanted to kind of really get into it, because I find it deeply fascinating. So let's jump right in. So here we have essentially our manuscript. This is just an example from 1213, and you can see it's a fairly good quality. It's got the kind of the standard kind of things you'd expect with the script, kind of this cursive elongation of certain letters. We can see here just kind of like an elongation of, especially on the N here, there, and this is very consistent throughout, actually, but essentially it's a very good quality manuscript. It's been quite easy to transcribe and everything, and so let's jump right into it. So the way that it works is that the manuscript is split up into, let's say, three main sections. We have the incomes, which is here. We then have the expenses, which in this case is on the following page. And then we have kind of more of an in-depth explanation about kind of some of the payments. Now, the reason for this was because essentially this era is marked by the treasurers and the prior kind of really trying to bolster financial management and to limit the powers of certain obedientaries, which we'll get into later, and kind of put checks and balance on the money coming in and going out of Canterbury. And so that's why we have the layout that we do, the standard structure that you'll find in this period. So what kind of incomes did Canterbury get? Well, if we look here, so firstly it starts off compotus tesorarium, so kind of the composition of the treasurer's accounts. After the feast of St. Michael, the fiscal year started on the feast day of St. Michael, and it's about the restitution of kind of the convent after the exile. So let's just quickly get into that before we jump into the incomes and everything themselves. So from 1207 to 1213, the Canterbury monks were in exile. They were shoved out of Canterbury itself. They crossed the channel over to France, where they went to Saint Omer and later to Saint Bertin. Why? Well, because of King John, the one and only. So essentially what happened is earlier in previous years, from around 1205, we see a succession crisis happen at Canterbury, where the previous archbishop dies, and the next one is due to be elected. Now, the monks have always held at Canterbury a privilege that says that they can choose who the next prior or archbishop will be. Now, what then happens is that the king then has his choice, and the papacy has their choice. So we see the king put forward, I believe, John de Grey from Bishop of Norwich. We see the monks put forward a person called Reginald. And then the papacy says, no, we've got the guy for the job. We've got a fellow called Stephen Langton, the infamous Stephen Langton. The monks accept this, but the king doesn't, and he refuses Langton to come to England and seek out his role. Now, what happens is that then, essentially, relations between John and the papacy break down, and this results in an interdict. In response to this interdict, John then seizes Canterbury and its estates. So throughout the whole period of time, John receives the incomes and, I guess you could say, manages the kind of, I guess you could argue, the secular part almost of Canterbury, the kind of the administration of it. And so here we are, 1213, this is our return. The monks have returned, and this is the first manuscript of detailing this. So we have the title. Now this is a very standard title, and now we have the receipts. So we have the first one of which is a very large one, and this is something that you see because part of kind of the Benedictine order was that was kind of the allowance of kind of making money, a business essentially. Now, Christ. One of the strongest ways to do so was through manors, and so that's what the first of these three kind of receipts are. So we see manerius cum London, essentially. We see £300, 322 pounds, 14 shillings, 11 denarii being given. Now, these would have been the estates around Kent and in London, and again, this constitutes a very large amount. You know, £322 might not seem a lot, but back in the kind of medieval era, this would have been an extremely large amount. We then see Gablo Moneriorum. Now, gablum was a type of money rent, again from estates, so this would have been more on the outskirts. Canterbury owned estates in Suffolk, in Lincoln, in Norfolk, around Kent, even as far as in Ireland. And so these would have been the money rents from them. And we see an amount of £21, 17 shillings, and 6 denarii. Now, what's really interesting is then we have this. Gulakinde. Now, this kind of shows, I guess, the attachments to Canterbury, its surrounding area, and also a very archaic system. Because this is called Gavelkind. And this was... Oh my gosh. Excuse me. This was essentially a form, a very old form of inheritance, partable inheritance, and kind of land tenure. So this is from before the conquest. It's believed that Gavelkind was implemented more or less throughout the whole country during the Saxon period. But after the conquest of 1066, we see that William the Conqueror promises Kent that it can keep Gavelkind inheritance so long as it provides loyalty. And so that's what we see here. We see the citizens from Gavelkind, and we see then an amount of £13, 15 shillings, and 10 denarii. I had 3 farmings as well. So this is really interesting that you have a combination of these 3 rents. Very, very large sums. And so now let's go down. So we have rents from Diursis, Locus, various places. We have tithes, decimus. So we see that from these sets of incomes anyways, we see £360, £378 being received at just from these few amounts. Now, it then goes on to do some more kind of, I guess you could argue, more internal incomes. So that's how they like to split it. They like to have external incomes for the first amount, then internal incomes for the second list. So we can already see that there's some serious money being made at Canterbury. Now we have domibus et scopis, so houses and shops. That's rendering, what's that? £14 and 18 shillings and 10 denarii. We then see reliefs, and we also see some various people giving money. We see a will of Roger the chaplain donating some money. We see some altars, the altar of Saint Blasi, more wills and testaments, etc., etc. We then get to oblaconibus, which is offerings. So firstly, what we see is here manus prioris duvorum. Now this is again from the exile, where essentially the prior of St. Martin's at Dover was put in charge of the shrines and altars at Canterbury. So essentially what happened is that then when the monks returned, he handed over all of the offerings that he gathered during the exile. And we see here 200 and what's this? XLV, £245 and 10 shillings. Now, what's really interesting is that this would tell us that during the exile, the number of pilgrims visiting the shrine over these 6 years was actually quite low. We see in the following year, if I cut to it, next one, the sum of offerings being £380 rather, in 1214 alone. And so for the prior of Dover to hand over £245, it shows that clearly over this period the number of pilgrims visiting Canterbury was very slim. So then we see various altars and shrines dotted around Canterbury. We see the great altar. We see this altar of Saint Mary, the cross, Saint Michael, the tomb. Very kind of one that gathers a vast amount of money that we see. The tomb of Saint Becket. Now this is at this point where before the translation is in 1220. So at this point it's just the tomb rather than the whole shrine that's soon to be built. So we see the sum of offerings being 300 and £21, which again, when we compare it back, £321 means that the income of Canterbury at this point, they're getting, relatively similar amounts from rents as they are from offerings. So it's split fairly 50-50. We're seeing about £300+ from both. We then see, again, some more incomes from various people. So if we turn to the next page, we then get expensa per talleas, expenses with receipts. So we then have, what's really interesting is that we're able to gather kind of a topography of who is at the who is at the cathedral, and who they are. So we have here a list of names and a list of jobs. So we see Richard the cellarer, John the subcellarer, Osbert the cellarer, Humphrey the chamberlain, Joseph the chamberlain, Andrew the sacrist, Roger the sacrist, William the garnerer, Simon the carpenter, Osbert the custodian of the crypt. All of these, what we would call obedientaries, allow us to have a look at some really interesting aspects of Canterbury. And so what we see is that basically the way that it's divided, the offices, is we see that there's two cellarers with a subcellarer. Now these people are in charge of kind of the food and drink of Canterbury, making sure everyone is supplied, making sure that guests are catered for, that the baker gets their wheat, that the brewer gets their hops, stuff like that, the management of the raw resources. And so they always get the most amount of money. So we see here that Richard the cellarer gets £180. We see that John gets £80. We see that Osbert gets £31. So we're looking at around just over £200 from these. Now if we cut to, let's say, the sacrists, who were in charge of the shrines and the altars, they get a merely, £32 and £4, so about £36, which compared to this, several £100s that the cellarers are getting, is vastly different. The chamberlain is slightly different. They get, £80 and £34. So again, kind of a midway between the two. They were in charge of kind of the clothing, the cloths, the various beddings, and I guess you could say amenities of the monks. We then scoot down to William the garnerer, £4 that he gets. The garnerer was essentially in charge of the granary, making wine. Canterbury made its own wine, not very much, because we see that basically in the expenses, which should even pop up. If I see here, perhaps on the other page, I'm not too sure, but it pops up at times. Essentially, Canterbury purchases wine from France, quite a lot of it as well, actually. Nevertheless, we have then some various other people that get some money. We have, Osbert of Spring, Richard of Berksaw. We also see here, which is interesting, the nephew of St. Thomas getting some money. Now, at this point, the nephew of St. Thomas was still alive, and in kind of, I guess you could say, generosity, he was given a cottage and also given some money as kind of reparation for what happened to his uncle. Just as we had seen, I guess you could say, with the incomes, you have like the external incomes and you have the internal incomes. So we have here expenses with receipts. Those are pretty much to individuals. Then we have expensa sine tallies, which is expenses without receipts. So here we have things like defense of the land, various businesses, so like investments, and others. And we also have a solution of debts. Now, obviously, at this point, because of being in exile, Canterbury is heavily in debt, and it's something that they have to pay. And we see here that they're paying £149 for their debts, which is really quite interesting. So if we compare, so we see an income, if we go back, summa Tocius receptor, we see 500 there, then we see CCCC, so that's £980 that they have as, £986 that we have as an income. From an total expenses, however, we see £829. So that kind of gives you an idea in this year how, at the very least, of the kind of essentially the kind of money that we're dealing with, and we have a remaining amount for the future of £100. £152 and 17 shillings and 2 denarii. So that kind of gives you an idea that the monks are left with a small piece of kind of money left over at the end of the year, but most of it is spent. Most of the amount that they get, they spend. And we see here their solution of debts, the payment of debts. Now, what's mostly interesting that we see in Canterbury throughout the years is this one in particular. Romeo Mercatori Bononi. So we see that Canterbury borrows vast numbers of vast figures, vast numbers of cash from merchants of Italy, particularly as we see here, Bologna, but we also see from Rome, Siena, even later on we see the odd couple of payments borrowing from the Jewish community in Canterbury. But nevertheless, I mean, as we can see here, a payment of £110. So it's some serious money that they're borrowing in order to stay afloat. Now, it constitutes, I was able to work out that the loans that they receive constitute about 20% of the total income. And so therefore, if you take that away, Canterbury would be in debt each year. Not by a massive amount, but nevertheless enough, to make a difference. So let's quickly have a look then at, here we go, again, Compotus Tesserarium, St. Michael after, the relaxation of the interdict. So we see this is in the year of 1214. So essentially, again, we have the set of standard incomes. We have the manors, the rent of the manors being £800. We see, pigs and kitchens, and again the gavel kind, etc., etc. But we're going to cut towards the end of this. So in this year, they are actually getting a vast amount, partially because, as we can see here, Empronto, which is £34. So this is where they start to gather some loans. So we see that as a result of all these various different things, the restoration of property, etc., etc., the sum of the total receipts is £2,038. Now, where does this come from? Well, if we quickly cut over to part of the, here we go, part of the, I'm trying to find it. Here we go, part of the payments. So basically, we see, if we go back quickly, we see that essentially Canterbury paid a fairly large amount of money. Here we go, for the restoration. Essentially, we have £1,129, which is a massive deal. I mean, that in itself is more than they got in the previous year as a whole. So where did this come from? Well, if we then scoot over to the following page, we can see part of the restorations. And so we see a vast array of payments. Particularly, what is of interest is the one. Let's see if I can find it. We have John Sancto Angelo Romano. That is another merchant of Rome. So they're borrowing, what's that, £14 for 7 years. We also see various other people. We see here in the restitutions. Ooh. Here we go. Domino Reggae, £1,000. Now, returning back to the interdict, basically for the troubles and annoyances incurred during it, John was forced afterwards to basically repay his debts and restore to the abbey what he owed them. So he gave them £1,000, which is a huge, huge amount. So we see in this year, essentially, the income jump from 900 in the previous year to about £2,638, which is a huge, huge amount. So what did they spend it on? Because if we cut quickly to the sum of expenses, we see that they the sum of the expenses were here we go, £2,448. So again, they're spending almost as much as they're getting. So what did they do? Well, we see again the cellars getting £256. We see this cellarer getting £700. We see the chamberlain getting £200, the sacrist getting £120. So again, they're just dishing out the money in relatively equal proportions, but drastically increasing the expenditure. Now, there aren't any particularly interesting ones here, apart from obviously the particular one about King John. But it gives you an idea of the kind of money that's being handled. Here we go. This is what I was discussing about France. Vino Regis Franci, the wine of the French king. So they're paying a good fair amount of money for that. So let's continue on. So we're in 1214. We then see, if I just quickly show, in 1215, where's the sum? Sum of total receipts that goes back down to 1,600. Then we see then a massive change in hand. Have a look at this. If I zoom right in, you can see it. Look how different this is to the previous. Now, what does this tell us? So we see here, if I go back quickly. Oh, no, we can go forwards from here. So we see this hand from 1216, okay? Ignoring this page, because this is something interesting that I'll talk about. We see the same hand in 1217. In 1218, however, it switches back to the one more similar that we'd been looking at. And this happens again. So we can see here, this is far more closer. This is from 1219. This is far closer. Then in 1220, it kind of switches back to then the one we saw before. So we're seeing a switch every 2 years or so. What does this tell us? Well, we know at Canterbury that there were 2 treasurers. We don't know, however, who they were, nor much about them. But we know that there were 2, which was a lot more than most places. Most places only had 1. Now, this would tell us, from using the handwriting, that essentially the treasurers rotated on a 2-year basis. So one monk would record the expenses and incomes for 1 year, and then the following year. But then on the 3rd year, he would switch to someone else. But because this kind of handwriting pops up at various points every 2 years, it shows that the monk, the treasurer, although switching, stays in office for 10 years, which is really, really fascinating stuff. And it tells you a bit about the kind of, I guess, the way in which Canterbury functioned. So if we look here, what's this? 1215. If we go to the sum, the total sum, which is, we've got obla conibus again. Look at you can see this borrowing in this year, £251. So much. Oh, here we go. Sum of total receipts, £1,370. which is a lot lower than what we've seen in previous years. Now, the primary reason for this is because at this point in time, you have the First Barons' War. So Magna Carta is signed, civil strife ensues. John is then at war with these rebellious barons. Now, the battlefield of this war primarily takes place in Kent and kind of Canterbury, which is why the essentially the kind of the money of Canterbury, the incomes and expenses, goes down drastically. Now, I actually have a graph, if please excuse my dissertation, but I have a fascinating graph that I can show you about the income and expenses. Ooh. Is it this one? Comparison? No, that's not it. No. Here we go. Income and expenses post-exile. So we see in 1213, it's very, very low. It then jumps up in 1214, primarily because, like we saw, of that of the £1,000 that was given. That was it. But then we see it jumps down from 1215 to 1217, and then comes back up to 1218. 1215 to 1217 is during the First Barons' War, so that's why that drops down. So if I go back to here, very fascinating stuff. But then, kind of talking about the manuscript as a whole, we then see this. Now let's just compare these folios. We see this one here is very, very good quality, very legible, very easy to see. Cut across to this one, and it's in ruin. It's awful. It's really old, and it's extremely faded. There's writing up here. You can kind of make out Compotus Tesserarium, something. But we have a date. Look at that. 1207. This was 1216. The one after it is 1217. We have a folio insert. Isn't that incredible? A folio insert from 1207, from before the exile. So we're allowed to see, we're able to see from this insert firstly, why this insert exists is beyond me, but it allows us to look at the comparison of the rents and incomes and expenses and offerings before and after the shrine, and it's absolutely fascinating. So essentially, if we cut down to where it has where is it? On the next page, I reckon. Oh no, I just saw it. So we see that in 1207, the total income was 1,440. 1,492 pounds. Which, if we then compare with here, 1,277 pounds, we can see that at the time of the First Barons' War, the income at the at Canterbury is a lot lower than it was before the exile, which you could, I guess, take as a kind of a consistent variable almost to measure against. So there we have it. Now we obviously have other things such as the in 1220 the translation takes place. Here it is, and we see here the tomb getting £200 alone. Oh, we see here the ferretro, which is the kind of the coffin, the translation itself, £700 received. So at this point, again, the total receipts shoot up from 1,200 in 1216 to now £2,707 in 1220. And from 1220 onwards, there is relatively a stable economy. It doesn't waver overly too much, apart from when we get to 1228, where there is a slight dip, not overly so much to cause an issue, but enough to be noticeable. The reason for this is, of course, the Sixth Crusade. Frederick II calls the Sixth Crusade, and England is to be participate in it, and so there is a slight dip in the expenses where obviously donations were given or people signed to the cross, etc., etc. But aside from that, after this period of strife, of much difficulty, essentially the translation provides Canterbury with so much income that it's able to become relatively financially free and stable for the remainder of the period, which is deeply, deeply fascinating, because before then they were struggling, and the income and expenses of the priory waver massively. And so there we have it. Thank you very much for kind of taking a little dive into the manuscript. I find it deeply interesting. Like I say, I mean, I've written 16,000 words on it, so I absolutely find it fascinating. There we go. We'll zoom in. So thank you very much for watching, and it's good to be back. And I'll be doing weekly podcasts. And hoping to do some awesome interviews as well. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend and week, and I'll see you next time.